You know that feeling when the alarm goes off, and before your eyes even fully open, there's already a quiet weight sitting in your chest? Nothing dramatic. Nothing you can easily explain. Just a kind of heaviness that makes even simple things feel slightly harder than they should. You get up, you move through the routine. Maybe you even do everything you're supposed to do. From the outside, it looks fine. Normal even. But somewhere in the background, there's this subtle resistance. Like a part of you is always hesitating, even when you keep going. Most people don't talk about that part, because from the outside, it doesn't look like a problem. You're functioning, you're responsible, you're doing what's expected. And when you try to describe that feeling, it often gets labeled in simple ways. Burnout, laziness, lack of motivation, maybe even ingratitude. But those labels don't quite fit, do they? Because it's not that you don't care. In fact, sometimes the problem is that you care too much about doing things properly, about being dependable, about not disappointing people, about staying stable, even when something inside you feels off. So instead of questioning the situation, you start questioning yourself. Maybe I just need more discipline. Maybe I'm overthinking. Maybe this is just how life is supposed to feel. And slowly, without realizing it, you begin to normalize something that doesn't actually feel natural to you. What's interesting is that this experience, this quiet, persistent resistance, is often misunderstood because it doesn't look like a breaking point. It looks like endurance. But there's more going on here than people realize, and this is where the real conversation begins. Because when people talk about quitting a job, they usually frame it as something dramatic, impulsive, risky, emotional. But sometimes it's none of those things. Sometimes it's the result of a long, almost invisible process happening inside you. A process your mind and body have been tracking long before you consciously acknowledged it. There's a concept in psychology called cognitive dissonance. It's what happens when your actions and your internal state don't align. When you're doing something consistently, that doesn't quite match who you are, what you value, or how you naturally function. At first, your brain tries to resolve that mismatch quietly. It tells you to adjust, to adapt, to push through. And for a while that works, but your nervous system is also paying attention. And it doesn't rely on logic the same way your thoughts do. It responds to patterns, repeated stress, subtle tension, emotional suppression, lack of autonomy, lack of meaning. Over time, these patterns start to register not as isolated moments, but as a continuous state. And that's when something shifts. You don't necessarily break, you just start feeling disconnected, less engaged, less present, less like yourself. Not because you've become weaker, but because your system is trying to protect you from something it no longer recognizes as sustainable. There's research in neuroscience showing that when people feel a lack of control over their environment, especially over long periods of time, the brain begins to reduce its engagement. It's not a failure, it's an adaptation, a way of conserving energy when something feels misaligned or unchangeable. And this is where it gets personal. Because for many people, this pattern doesn't start with work, it starts much earlier. Growing up in environments where stability mattered more than expression, where being responsible was valued more than being aligned, where you learned, sometimes without realizing it, that safety came from doing what was expected, even if it didn't fully match how you felt inside. So you became good at adapting, good at staying consistent, good at pushing through discomfort without making it visible. And those traits, they help you succeed in structured environments. They make you reliable, capable, even admired, but they also come with a quiet cost. Because the same ability that allows you to stay can also make it harder to recognize when staying is no longer right for you. You don't react immediately. You endure, you rationalize, you adjust yourself instead of questioning the situation. And because of that, the signal doesn't come as a loud, "This is wrong." It comes as a slow, persistent feeling that something isn't quite right anymore. Now, it's important to say this clearly. This isn't about one path being better than another. Staying is not wrong. Leaving is not automatically right. Some people thrive in stability, in structure, in predictability. Others need movement, change, alignment. Neither is superior. They're just different ways of being, and the difficulty comes when you're living in a way that doesn't match your internal wiring for too long. Because eventually, your system starts asking for something different. Not loudly, but consistent. And this is where the idea of quitting becomes misunderstood. Because from the outside, it looks like you're walking away from something secure. But internally, it can feel more like you're responding to something that's been building for a long time. Not a sudden decision, but a gradual recognition. There's also a paradox here that people don't often talk about. The longer you stay in something that doesn't fit, the harder it becomes to leave. Not because you're incapable, but because you've built a life around that structure. Your identity, your routine, your sense of safety, they all start to attach to it. So leaving doesn't just feel like a change, it feels like a disruption to who you've been. And at the same time, staying carries its own quiet cost. A slow drifting away from parts of yourself that don't get expressed in that environment. This is the trade-off, stability on the outside, or alignment on the inside. And for some people, there comes a point where the internal misalignment becomes more difficult to ignore than the external uncertainty. Not because they've become reckless, but because they've started listening more closely to what's been there all along. It's also worth noticing that the desire to leave doesn't always come from dissatisfaction alone. Sometimes it comes from growth, from outgrowing a version of yourself that once fit perfectly in that space, but doesn't anymore. And that can be confusing, because nothing is necessarily wrong. The job might be fine, the people might be fine, but you feel different. And when there's no obvious problem, it's easy to dismiss that feeling, to tell yourself you should be content, to stay because it makes sense on paper. But your system doesn't operate on paper. It operates on lived experience, on how something feels repeatedly over time. And when that feeling consistently leans toward resistance rather than engagement, it's not something to ignore indefinitely. This doesn't mean every uncomfortable feeling is a sign to leave. Discomfort can also mean growth, but there's a difference between discomfort that expands you and discomfort that slowly disconnects you. One feels challenging but alive. The other feels heavy, even when nothing is visibly wrong. And learning to notice that difference takes time. It takes honesty. It takes a willingness to sit with what you actually feel without immediately trying to fix or justify it. Because often the clarity you're looking for isn't something you force. It's something that becomes obvious when you stop overriding your own signals. So if you've been feeling that quiet resistance, that subtle sense that something isn't quite aligned anymore, it doesn't mean you're ungrateful. It doesn't mean you're weak. And it doesn't mean you've failed at building a stable life. It might simply mean that a part of you has evolved and is now asking for something different, something that fits the person you've become, not just the person you had to be. And that's not a flaw. It's a form of awareness, a kind of internal honesty that doesn't always show up loudly, but stays with you until you're ready to acknowledge it. You're not broken for feeling this way. Your experience makes sense, even if it's hard to explain to others. And whatever you decide, whether you stay, leave, or take time to figure it out, it doesn't define your worth. It's just a reflection of where you are, in a process that most people go through quietly. If any part of this felt familiar, there's probably more to explore there. Not answers you need to rush into, just patterns worth noticing. And if this resonated with you in some quiet way, you can let that be a signal, not just something to move past. You can share it with someone who might be feeling the same, but hasn't found the words for it yet. You can stay connected to more of these reflections by subscribing if you feel like continuing this kind of conversation. Because sometimes understanding yourself doesn't happen all at once. It happens slowly, in moments like this, where something finally makes sense.